Welcome to Cancel Culture, the Business of Law podcast brought to you by Byfield. Welcome back to Cancel Culture, the Business of Law podcast. This week, I've got Michael, who's back on the podcast after a while. Michael's joining us from Mexico City, where he is currently for the IBA. Hello, Michael. Or hola,
Hey,
should
Meg.
I say?
Hola.
How's this week going for you?
It's been good, right? This is, I think, since I started going to the IBA again after a 18-year break a couple of years ago, this is my third one. It's really good. Mexico City is a fantastic city. I think there's about 4,500 people here. And yeah, there's been elements of it being kind of a bit more dramatic in certain respects than the IBA usually is.
Tell us
I don't know.
more.
I don't know if you saw what happened. I don't know if you know anything about what's been happening recently in terms of political developments in Mexico, or if you saw anything about the opening ceremony. Have you seen anything?
No, I haven't actually. I've not read yet the stuff on Global Legal Post.
Okay. Well, there's going to be shortly a change of leadership here in presidency, and the outgoing president has, launched some very, very aggressive reforms to the judiciary, kind of out of nowhere. I'm not going to claim to be an expert. This is based on talking to people and listening at the opening ceremony. But it seems like the outgoing president has been at war with the legal system and the judiciary for quite some time. And this is his kind of, as he's in his last few weeks, this is his revenge. And he's basically rushed through legislation that will completely replace the judiciary at all levels over the next couple of years with elected judges. So instead of appointed ones, going to elected, which of course raises all sorts of questions in terms of impartiality, neutrality, political interference, and I kid you not, this is how vindictive or petty it is. It was signed into law after being rushed through the chambers, the House, etc. It was signed into law on Sunday, so on a weekend. On not just that, on a weekend that was also a public holiday, 2 hours before the IBA conference started.
That sends a message, I guess. Yeah.
Yep, and we had the president of the Mexican Supreme Court up on stage. At one point, at several points, she was on the edge of tears as she was talking about what was happening here. And then we had Ernesto Zedillo, who's a former president of Mexico, give an absolutely sort of fire and brimstone, this is going to bury Mexican democracy kind of attack on the outgoing president. Absolutely sort of blistering, long speech, but very powerful. And then that led all the news in Mexico the next day.
Wow.
And so, I'm not going to say that IBA opening ceremonies are boring usually. Of course they're not. They're usually, there's a bit of music. There's usually a bit of a sort of...
Last year was good.
Yeah, last year's was good. Michel Barnier was very good, actually. But this was it almost felt like it was slightly hijacked by politics.
Yeah.
I'm not. Even the IBA leadership seemed a little dazed and confused by the forceful nature of the speeches and the passion on display. So that was that. It started with a bang, and. The reality is this does raise certain questions. It does raise elements of concerns for Mexico's democracy. You've got 25 years of investment in judicial training and really upgrading the skills and the experience of judges in Mexico, which is just going to go completely out the window. And then there's the question of will a judge elected in, say, Cancun, who's who is got to rule on a dispute between, a company in Cancun versus one in Mexico City, is there going to be impartiality there? Because he or she has got to think about the people who elected him or her, and they're there, if they're in Cancun or whatever, then that's one thing. But there's also the, just being beholden to the people who elected, the people who funded the election campaigns and all of this sort of thing. I know in the States you've got a mixture of appointed and elected hasn't necessarily worked out all that well. But then again, you look at the Supreme Court stuff and you're not sure if appointments have either. So,
I was going to say, appointments, I'm not sure if, like, depending on the government you've got, I'm not sure it's quite fair either. So, yeah.
Yeah. But it was quite something. I mean, Zidio was saying, the president's frustration at not having a submissive court has evolved into brutal revenge, the destruction of the independence and integrity of the judiciary, so that it is at the service of the political force in power, which is, pretty forceful stuff, right? And so yeah, I think it did go. It was quite long. I think the opening ceremony was a good couple of hours, but it you felt like you were. A news event was unfolding around in front of your eyes, basically. And it was literally, I turned up just to expect the usual, stuff, nice words about the importance of the rule of law and, how great it is to be in Mexico City and so on. And then it was like, hang on a minute, this is not that. And then I think it's been. We all got a slightly false impression of the traffic situation in Mexico City because it was national holiday. It was their Independence Day on the Monday, so it was a holiday weekend. So it was nice and quiet. It took like 15-20 minutes in a taxi from like the hotel area to get to the conference center, and then since Tuesday, it's been like a lot harder kind of chaos, and you can see that because it's such a huge city, but it's been good. Lots of the sessions have been good. We've had one on war crimes on where they're talking about evidence collection in the war in Ukraine, and Hollywood actor and activist Liv Schreiber was here to participate in a panel discussion, and that was. They were talking about how the war in Ukraine is the most documented war in history, but how important that is to one day be able to hold Putin and others to account. Potentially whether that's in their lifetime or through the lens of history, I don't know. But the meticulously digitizing data and evidence collection is super important to enable that to happen. And it was also great to have a little bit of a dash of stardust as well with an actor there. So that was a really good session. We have had talk by a former US ambassador to Russia saying America's fallen asleep at the wheel again, relating to Russian aggression, which it's a perspective. And yeah, I did a talk yesterday, which was good fun.
Tell us more.
It was on the challenging issue of to speak or not to speak. How if at all should law firms speak about challenging and volatile geopolitical situations such as Israel, Hamas, and the war in Ukraine. And we had a full room pretty much. I put a bit of a poll up on LinkedIn in prep, and I think it's still open at the moment. Well, it'll have closed by the time this is out. But as is the way, I think, with any difficult question these days, you'll be shocked to hear that it ended up 50-50. So, yeah. It was like, oh God, come on. And so we had a good, fairly vigorous debate, I think, on I'd got some input from some contacts at large firms and smaller firms who've been kind enough to email me their thoughts anonymously as preparation, and it was. And I kind of read those out, or extracts of those out, obviously anonymously. We had the poll, etc., and we talked quite a lot about, the general principle of neutrality. But then there are times when you have to stand up for things, and the developments in Mexico would be one example of that, where if there is fundamentally an attack on the rule of law or the legal profession, and what it stands for.
Yeah.
Then
it's
clearly
to retaliate.
You have to stand up for yourself.
Yeah.
We did have some debate though about whether that is best done through law societies and bars, and through individual lawyers' voices speaking for themselves, as opposed to being through firms. And there was a Mexican lawyer who talked about, and there was a Mexican lawyer who talked about that, and I think there was a Nigerian lawyer as well who talked about it being difficult because in some emerging markets, you need to stand up and fight, because otherwise, if you don't, others will. Will fill the void, and you may find that the ability to practice is taken away from you. But how do you do it in a way which doesn't contaminate your own practice or business, or see you targeted or excluded from work by political opponents or whatever? So that was it was a good discussion. The conclusions were that this is very complicated. Big firms, obviously, as we've seen, have tied themselves up in knots a little bit in recent years because of, setting a precedent with Black Lives Matter for commenting on and leaning into taking positions on certain things. But then you create an expectation then that you say things, and it's not really. I don't think the media necessarily expect it too much. There are extremes where, like Russia, Ukraine, where yes, they do. But I think it's internal, it's stakeholders. I'm not sure that clients really care, except in very extreme circumstances. The media, yes, they do want to hear from firms more now than they used to because of that precedent being set. But I think really it's the internal stakeholders and people wanting to feel heard, wanting to feel seen. But balancing that with the general principle of remaining neutral, because it's about provision of legal services, not taking political situations. Ultimately, it is very hard, and big firms in particular, big complicated firms, are more exposed than others because they'll be present in a lot of different jurisdictions. They've got bigger communities to serve, and just more people with more opinions. So it was good. I'd have liked us to have come to some firmer conclusions. But that wasn't really the case, unfortunately. In terms of other sessions that have been pretty good, there was a very good one on human rights, where we're looking at to some extent the role of the profession in terms of the wider duties to society. So, the kind of classic good lawyers and bad clients, but the increasing scrutiny that the legal profession faces when representing clients that, conflict with broader societal duties. So that was the Professional Ethics Committee, the Bar Issues Commission, the Law Firm Management Committee, did a session on that, and it was good. Stephen Revel was very good, talking about, I think he said the profession has kind of compartmentalized its approach to responsibilities, with AML and KYC compliance in one bucket, sanctions and anti-bribery, anti-corruption stuff in another. ESG and sort of discussions about the firm, the clients the firm wants to represent over here. And he was saying, made a good argument for the fact that these are all kind of pillars to an overall role and responsibilities that a profession has, to not just to clients, but also to wider society. Again, not an easy topic, but it was interesting. It wasn't there weren't hundreds of people in the room, but the Slido polling that they did was showed that only 23% of those in the room said their firms have a policy or checklist for tackling scenarios where client work could conflict with these wider duties. Nearly 3/4 agreed with a statement that law firms take decisions solely with commercial interests in mind. And it was pretty much 50-50 between whether firms should adopt a more transparent policy on how they consider the impact of client instructions in terms of societal harm. So I think, practitioners are very much coming at this from a perspective of I know that this debate is evolving, but fundamentally it is a bit different around the world. And there's an Indian lawyer, for example, who said that in his reading of his obligations, it would be unethical for a lawyer to refuse to provide counsel to a client with legal needs and the means to pay for advice.
Yeah.
And so, that was interesting, and we've got to be careful not to take a purely sort of Anglo-centric view or developed market view, because there are lots of smaller jurisdictions and lots of small firms where lawyers don't necessarily have the luxury of having sophisticated tools available to them, and they'll be working in different regulatory environments. But they did give the example, and I kind of was vaguely aware of this, but I'd be I think I know which firm it is, but I can't say that I know for sure. But it talks about there's an example of a large firm, a very large firm, that had put in place a policy to decline to act for certain types of company on certain types of matters, and how that had led to a number of partners leaving that firm because they didn't wish to comply with the policy. But the panelists were saying that despite it being difficult, prediction is that more and more firms will put that type of policy in place. They also talked a bit about GCs being under pressure. There was a strategic advisor called Jennifer Swallow who was representing the GC community, and she was talking about how she'd mounted a complaint to the SRA complaining about their thematic review, which found that there wasn't much by way of risk issues for GCs. Whereas, she was saying that actually there are lots of examples of GCs being asked to facilitate illegal or unlawful behaviour, from being asked to help to cover up sexual harassment or bullying incidents to facilitating money laundering, and that the GC community needs to talk more about this, because they're in a position where they can. I think, as she described it, sort of a capitulate or resign position at times. You either go, unless you've got, because they don't have the same support structures and necessarily that private practitioners do. And so the role of their duties as a lawyer, as well as just an employee, need to be brought more to the forefront. Again, I don't know how big a problem this is, but it was a really interesting angle to take on the topic.
Well, and I guess also for that stuff with the SRA's new rules on kind of, if you witness or you're aware of kind of bullying or harassment, that kind of stuff at your firm, even if you're not in private practice, but I guess if you do know of that, you have a duty to report it to the SRA now. So it's kind of, even from a regulatory standpoint, I think that if that's a common thing, I think that's going to change. I'm hoping it's not, but for the ones who've done that kind of cover up, I think that will probably change quite quickly. Interesting. That sounds really fascinating. Good week.
Yeah, no, very much so. And good events. The Ministry of Justice and the Law Society of England and Wales put on a good party at the Four Seasons last night. A bunch of affirmed parties have been good. DLA did a very good one out at the, I think it was Lago Algo, I think it was called. It's on a lake, basically, in a one of the big areas of woodland in the middle of Mexico City, which is pretty awesome. And it's Law Rocks tonight, which I'm sure will be good. So yeah, overall, I think a good IBA. I think a little bit of somewhat fewer people than in Paris last year, possibly because it's a little bit further for people to come from Europe. But I don't think that was a bad thing. I found Paris a little bit hectic last year.
Yeah, I think Paris was just too small to accommodate for so many people at the same time. Though, to be fair, we're getting used to it now with the Olympics and whatnot, I guess, So let's just jump into kind of the main stories, I guess, of the last 2 weeks. So obviously there have been some office closures recently. So Johannesburg being probably the key kind of location where Hogan, Lovells and A&O Shearman closed there. Hogan, Lovells also closed in Sydney and Warsaw. Obviously, that's triggered a lot of conversations over the last couple of weeks. So it's just kind of fascinating to see that firms are pulling back on some of their office space now. I mean, what do you think of all this so far?
We haven't had a cycle. Well, no, that's not true. We've seen it in China with a lot of US firms in particular closing offices, but that's economics and geopolitics.
Yeah, and security reasons. Yeah.
Yeah, and and trade tensions, etc. I think it's geopolitics more than it is economics. What we haven't seen, I think, is big firms taking steps back from quite significant markets. Nobody can say, you can't look at South Africa and say it's not a meaningful legal center or economy. It's certainly a challenging jurisdiction in certain respects, but it's got an extremely advanced legal system. If you think back to apartheid days, a huge amount of there's a whole generation of incredibly talented English lawyers, South African lawyers who came to England and became incredibly influential and some of the best practitioners, both at the bar or as solicitors that we saw in those times. Yeah. It's also over 400 billion GDP. It's not a small market. Equally, Sydney. Nobody can say Sydney, Australia is not an important economy. So what you're seeing is I think firms taking decisions based on whether they've been able to make things work rather than, we must have an office there because it's a big place with lots of potential work. And I think previously there's been a little bit of stigma around accepting that maybe you didn't make it well, you were struggling to make it work in a particular jurisdiction. And it would be humiliating to sort of pull the plug. And I think the combination of A&O Shearman doing it because obviously they've gone through this merger, there's probably quite a bit more to come. I don't mean in terms of office closures, but in terms of restructuring, in terms of changes, in terms of integration, there'll be a huge amount of work to do there. Yeah. And also now Hogan Lovells, I don't have any insight into the decision making, etc. But clearly there are offices that for whatever reason weren't quite delivering what the firm needed in terms of financial metrics, perhaps, or strategic vision in terms of where it sees so this move towards sort of a slight concentration in particular markets is following on the heels, I think, of what some of the really hyper profitable US firms like Latham and Watkins have done and others in recent years, which is really abandon that sort of planting a flag somewhere to really triple down on just a chosen number of commercial and financial centers and focus relentlessly on those, and which places those are will vary slightly, I think, for firms. But I think what might happen next is we may see some herd mentality coming into play where leaders of other law firms who are maybe have had it on their mind to close down or withdraw from one or two markets where it doesn't really fit with the strategy, or there's been quite a lot of financial underperformance relative to where the firm wants to be on those metrics. They may take this window of opportunity to accelerate those plans potentially. I'm not saying you'll see it wholesale, but we may see a few other firms doing it because it's easier to do it undercover when you've got cover of other firms doing it. It's less reputationally consequential, and it just feels easier, and that's just the way of things. And it's a tried and tested tradition of, in the legal sector, if somebody else does something and you think, oh yeah, that makes sense, we're going to do that too. It won't be across the board, but I would be very unsurprised if a few more firms followed in that respect. Equally, that creates opportunities because some of those impacted will be great offices with great lawyers. They maybe just didn't fit with the firm strategy. So there will be opportunities, I think, for international firms who are remaining committed to those jurisdictions, like South Africa, or strong local firms. I mean, I think it was Bowman's, who were talking to the A&O Shearman office. I haven't kept up since last week, so I don't know if that's been superseded. But there'll be opportunities for strong regional or domestic players, I think, to benefit from taking on some really good partners and lawyers from the decisions that big firms are taking to withdraw in certain circumstances.
Yeah, no, I think it's, I think the situation in South Africa is particularly difficult just because, at least for the ones from A&O Shearman, I think it was in Alfred's piece at Law.com that it seems that a lot of the partners will not get paid as much, regardless of where they move. So I think for a lot of them, it is a hit regardless. But hopefully everyone will find a new home pretty promptly. It's a really unfortunate situation. Obviously, it's because of the wider economic situation of the country. So it kind of makes sense. But yeah, as you said, I think a lot of firms will just kind of potentially, well, not a lot, but some other firms might jump on the bandwagon just because, yeah, as you said, it's easier. And it's kind of, after 3-4 firms do it, what else is new? Do you know what I mean? You've had time to analyze everyone's statements and kind of make one that feels kind of similar, but not too much, that still has got your touch. So I guess it kind of makes sense if anyone wanted to kind of do that. I gotta say, the Hogan Lovells ones, I was surprised by some of the locations, but not shocked. I would have thought some other locations would go first, but fair enough. I don't think it says too much about the economic situations of either firms, to be honest, just because, A&O Shearman is going through post-merger kind of financial consolidation and whatnot. So that means, obviously, that there will be some of these redundancies. That's kind of expected. But, again, Hogan Lovells is a big firm, really kind of profitable. So I don't think it was for economic reasons, but it in the local markets that they were operating in, it would make sense if it wasn't quite performing the way they were hoping to. So yeah, it is interesting. It's definitely one to keep an eye out on, for future firms to do the same thing. We've had the same in London with, Armstrong Teasdale kind of in the process of shutting down in London. So
yes, and apparently,
and that's quite different.
apparently paying its people statutory redundancy, which I think Colin Passmore, the head of the City of London Law Society, has called them out on LinkedIn. So I do think that it in terms of impact on people and reputationally, it's not a good look for a firm that made over $200 million last year to be unwilling or unable to pay people in London more than statutory redundancy as they kind of wind down their office here and close. I think having worked through, having done the communications around rounds of redundancies at major firms when I was in-house, you always give thought. You always have to give thought, quite careful thought, to what message you're sending to the market in your decisions. What consequence it's going to have on your reputation. if you don't get it right, and to be respectful to people, because it is different if a firm is going bust, right?
Yeah.
That's fine. It is a different scenario then, and we've seen that from time to time with quite big firms. When things collapse, they go fast. And so you're not necessarily in the position to be able to look after your people. Although there have been instances where even in the most difficult situations, lead management of firms that are going to the wall have worked incredibly hard to find out placements for people, and so on. So, I think if you're a partner at a firm that's gone under, or the London office has gone under, in this case, if you didn't do everything that you could for your people, that's going to follow you around.
Yeah.
When you land at another firm, because if partners probably be fine. I don't know anything, but there are reputational consequences not just at the firm level, but also at the individual level too. So I think that'll be interesting one to see. So I think we should. I'd like to hear how it was at the Legal Business Awards.
Oh yeah, it was great. Yeah, Ben and Liam handed out some awards this week. So yeah, for RPC and Freaks.
Which categories were we? We were sponsoring a couple of categories, right?
Yeah, we were sponsoring Marketing Initiative of the Year and Law Firm of the Year. So yeah, Ben was buzzing. We had a good time. It was a great venue, great food, great people. No, I think everyone had a good time. Yeah, and it's always one of those. I've not been to an awards event in a long time now, so it was kind of nice to be back and kind of see some people and just have a good time, really. So yeah, it was fun. It was fun. I think the team was really, really happy to be there.
Great, fantastic. And can we call ourselves a top 20 UK business podcast now?
Well, I guess we can. I guess we can, above the Wall Street Journal podcast, so that's great. So yeah, everyone, thank you so much for listening. To you guys.
And I think we want to get some more good guests on too. So if you're listening and you want to come on and you've got a good case for doing so, then we want to hear from people who think they've got something to bring to future episodes and come on as guests. All right, Meg?
Yeah, absolutely. So feel free to message me anytime on LinkedIn or an email. But yeah, I think that's the end of the episode for this week. Have a safe trip back to London, Michael, tomorrow when it comes.
Thank you.
And to the listeners, we're on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, so feel free to listen to that anytime and connect with me if you want to come on.
You've been listening to Counsel Culture, the Business of Law podcast brought to you by Byfield. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and join us again next week, where we'll be discussing some more of the biggest stories in the legal sector.